Hey everybody. A couple of quick notes before we get started on this week's episode. First of all, we got some new video recording equipment, which I am super excited about. But unfortunately, we ran into some technical issues right off the bat with it. So that's why this week's episode is in a bit of a different format. But hey, congratulations. You don't have to look at my ugly mug this week. So lucky you. Second of all of that happened right when we were leaving for a long weekend trip. So some of the items that I talk about as happening, for example, this week, I think I say a lot. It didn't happen this week anymore. But don't worry, it's all still relevant. It's still up to date and important information. So give it a listen, and I'll see you soon. Welcome in, everybody, to episode 5 of Awakening the Ordinary. There are 4 things that I want to talk about with you this week. 4 things that are heavy on my heart and heavy on my mind, and frankly, in some ways, keeping me up at night because we are in some scary times. So, without further ado, the 4 topics that I want to cover today are the war in Ukraine and our current government response to it. This is not a diplomatic relations podcast. This is not a foreign affairs podcast. Honestly, there is so much backstory and history that you need to understand all of the intricate ins and outs that go into that kind of thing. And uh, that's not what we're doing here. But in this particular case, I think there is an angle that people aren't considering, and I want to bring it up. I want to make sure that people are keeping a little bit of the recent history in mind when we talk about Ukraine. I also wanted to talk about what's going on in New York City. Surprise, surprise. The New York City mayor has a scandal. Can you believe it? Has that ever happened before? Honestly, a better question is, has that ever not happened before? But yes, the New York City mayor is under fire for actually some stuff that's been going on for a while now. And in particular, there are some modern day heroes, and I do not use that word lightly, that have stepped up to respond. Afterwards, I want to talk about what is maybe the biggest news of the week that is, frankly, not getting much coverage at all. President Trump signed a pretty extensive executive order. He is embracing the Unitarian theory to its illogical extreme. And I want to talk about some possible implications and really just get your pulse on it, because honestly, I have not heard people talking about this, and I think it's big news. And then finally, I just want to wrap things up with, I guess you could call it kind of a heart to heart. I have been reaching out to people that I don't agree with on everything. I was trying to take some of my own advice and get some discussion going on. And there is one particular thing that I am consistently hearing about why people refuse to vote Democrat. And I just want to talk about that with you guys and see, do you agree? Do you think it's reasonable? Do you think it's a good foundation to base your ideas on? But to start with our first issue, I want to talk about Ukraine. And to do that, I actually want to rewind a little bit. If you will, take a walk with me back to the wonderful, amazing year, 1994. Now, 1994 tensions were still incredibly high with the former USSR, Russia, and some of its former nation states, I guess, Ukraine and others, wanted to integrate better into the modern Western world. And part of that was the fact that the United States, along with the United Kingdom and Russia, came to a trilateral agreement with Ukraine. We asked them to denuclearize. You see, they had a pretty substantial stockpile of nuclear weapons. They were a former USSR state, and because of their geographic location so far to the west, that's where Russia kept a lot of their nukes. So they were essentially much more powerful than their size and status would have indicated. Because of that imbalance of power, and to help normalize relations with the West, we approached Ukraine and asked them to give it up. We said we would respect their sovereignty, we would have their back, and in exchange, we wanted them to give up their one silver bullet, the one piece of defense that they had that would guarantee their safety no matter what. After stringent debate, they agreed. They went ahead and turned over their nuclear arsenal to Russia, and they counted on us to keep them safe. Back during the Obama administration, Russia mounted an incursion on Ukraine and took over Crimea. And there's a lot of backstory that goes into that. Like I said, this is not a foreign relations podcast. We're not going to dive into the storied history of Russia, Ukraine, all of its territories. But suffice to say, Crimea was in many ways ethnically and culturally Russian. And so when Russia came to claim Crimea, frankly, the international community did not make much of a fuss. Afterwards, relations started to normalize again. And all of a sudden, 3 years ago, Russia decided to wage a brutal, illegal, and evil war on Ukraine. Recently, our president, Trump, has made some pretty inflammatory statements about this war. First of all, saying that it was Ukraine's fault, and second of all, calling their current president, Zelensky, a dictator. I just want to set the record straight in case any of you are not super well versed in foreign affairs. Saying that this war is in any way Ukraine's fault is not only an outright fabrication and lie, it is egregious. It is victim blaming at its worst. Ukraine is waging right now an entirely defensive war. Their people are dying because Russia, as they typically are, has been the aggressor in all of this. And to call President Zelensky a dictator because elections have not run while there is an ongoing war is frankly ignorant. I mean, really. The opposition party in Ukraine does not want elections to happen right now. They have been very forthright about that. And if you think about it, it's just common sense. To have an election, you have to have voting booths. You have to have areas where people can gather in large numbers safely to vote. And when there are rockets exploding all around you, that's not an option. So to say that President Zelensky is some kind of dictator because he is not holding elections right now is frankly ridiculous. And really, it's all part of this flood the zone operation that President Trump is running, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. I wanted to bring up the fact that right now, the U.S. has essentially decided to cut off all foreign aid to Ukraine. And not only are we cutting off our foreign aid, which is made up of about 40% loans that will be paid back and 60% grants, essentially. But that also means that we're not selling them our weapons anymore, which, again, frankly, does not make any sense economically. We have a surplus of weapons. Why in the world would we not want to sell it to somebody fighting one of our greatest enemies? But aside from all of that, One thing that I really don't think is being talked about enough is the fact that in 1994, we promised to be there for them. And that agreement ran its course. And afterwards, we told them, even though that treaty has expired, we still have your back. We still have your back. I'm sure there are many of you out there who have been in situations where you thought somebody was going to have your back. You really put yourself out there and you were counting on somebody to go out there with you, to back you up. And if they didn't, it would have hurt. It would have been a deep betrayal. When you're considering what's happening in Ukraine right now, I need you to multiply that by the hundreds of thousands. Because right now, every day, Ukraine is losing lives to this evil, terrible war crime that's going on now for 3 years. Regardless of your political stances, regardless of your desire for fiscal responsibility, I just want you to consider the moral implications of backing out of an agreement like that. And more than that, if you just want to be purely pragmatic about the situation, if you don't want to consider morals or ethics at all, consider the fact that Ukraine denuclearized at our urging. Do you think in the near future any other country is going to denuclearize no matter what guarantees we give them? No, because we are showing that it doesn't matter what we promised 30 years ago. It matters what's convenient for us right now. So if you want your children and your children's children to live in a world where nuclear proliferation has taken hold, by all means. But I don't want that future for our kids. Second of all, I wanted to discuss this issue that's going on in New York City. And holy cow, this is honestly straight out of a movie. Mayor Eric Adams of New York City is, or was rather, under investigation for a series of charges. It was bribery, fraud, soliciting foreign campaign donations. Essentially, what happened was he allowed a building in New York to be built and occupied and used without getting the appropriate permits first. And Turkey paid him large sums of money and brought him on like lavish vacations, gave him large gifts to do so. And not only did he accept these gifts and do what they wanted, but he also tried to cover it up. He tried to form fake paper trails to ensure that it looked like he had paid for everything himself. So he knew what he was doing was wrong. It's not like he could plead ignorance in any way, which frankly would not be a good excuse, but he knew what he was doing was wrong. He broke the law and was pretty much found out. I mean, it was basically an open and shut case. The Trump administration stepped in to intervene. The deputy attorney general sent a letter to the acting attorney in New York City instructing her to essentially temporarily put a hold on the case. And I say it in specifically those terms because they weren't instructed to drop the charges entirely and dismiss the case outright, as in find him not guilty or find that there was just insufficient evidence to charge him. They were instructed to put it on hold for pretty specific reasons. They wanted to have leverage over Eric Adams. They came to a deal with him. They said, we are going to put these charges on hold for you. And in exchange, you are going to revoke the sanctuary status of New York City, meaning that he was going to cooperate and let the Trump administration hunt for illegal immigrants in New York City the way that they wanted to. Regardless of your feeling on looking for illegal immigrants, a quid pro quo between the federal government and the local government to put charges on hold to ensure that somebody does something that you want them to do under threat of going to jail if they go back on that promise is not okay. And that's not just me saying that. There are two people that I want you to keep in mind. Danielle Sassoon was the attorney in charge of the case, and she was a very well-known and renowned conservative attorney. She clerked for Antonin Scalia, the Honorable Conservative Justice. So I just want to emphasize Danielle Sassoon was not some raging liberal Trump derangement syndrome crazy person. She was deeply conservative. She worked for a superstar conservative judge, and she told the Trump administration that they could go pound sand. She wrote a really wonderful, in-depth letter that you can find online, and I highly encourage you, if you have the time, go check it out if you want more details on this case, because she really broke it down in great detail as to why she thought it was immoral and unethical to drop these charges, how she thought it was a completely open and shut case, and her refusal to do so. She is, in no uncertain terms, a modern day hero. She resigned her position as an attorney for New York City, the Southern District of New York, by the way, which, if you have ever watched Law and Order, you have heard. The Southern District of New York is renowned nationwide for being one of the most important and powerful legal districts in the country. Many high-profile cases run through there because many, many powerful people live in the Southern District of New York and commit crimes there. So she resigned from her position, taking a moral and ethical stand. She didn't have any sort of partisan ideals. She just had her own moral and ethical code. I find that incredibly admirable, because not only did she lose her job over this, she potentially lost her livelihood and potentially harmed her reputation, but she even put her life at risk. There is a long history, unfortunately, going back to 2016, of people that stand up to the Trump administration receiving death threats, having their homes broken into. But she disregarded the danger to herself professionally, personally, and she stood on her morals. She stood up to something that she knew was wrong. I mentioned there are two people that I want you to keep in mind, because there is another person who also stepped down in a little bit more dramatic fashion. His name is Hagen Schotten. And he stepped down also by writing a letter. He did not write a long, lengthy, detailed letter explaining exactly why, step by step, it would be wrong to drop the charges. He wrote about half a page, and I want to read an excerpt here for you. This is just the very last paragraph. There is a tradition in public service of resigning in a last-ditch effort to head off a serious mistake. Some will view the mistake you are committing here in the light of their generally negative views of the new administration. I do not share those views. I can even understand how a chief executive whose background is in business and politics might see the contemplated dismissal with leverage as a good, if distasteful, deal. But any assistant U.S. attorney would know that our laws and traditions do not allow using the prosecutorial power to influence other citizens, much less elected officials, in this way. If no lawyer within earshot of the president is willing to give him that advice, then I expect you will eventually find someone who is enough of a fool or enough of a coward to file your motion. But it was never going to be me. Please consider this my resignation. I find that to be not only impressive on a personal level, if you'll pardon my French, I find that to be incredibly badass. This man stood on his moral foundation. He decided that his morals and his ethics were more important than his personal politics. And he told people in power over him that he was not going to submit to their will. In his letter, even, in the excerpt that I read, he mentioned he does not have a negative view of this administration. There's a pretty high likelihood that he's a Trump voter. I mean, this guy also clerked for conservative Supreme Court justices. This guy is again, a renowned conservative lawyer, but he didn't let his politics get in the way of his morals. And I think that's a lesson we all need to take to heart. I wanted to bring these two to your attention because I truly believe these are modern day heroes putting themselves at risk by speaking out to authority in a way that endangers their livelihood and endangers their life. I think we could all learn a lesson in standing up for our personal morals. I urge you strongly to look up these guys. Take a look at this case. Get inspired by these two and the rest who resigned as well. I mean, there was a slew of people who resigned after being told to dismiss these charges because they knew it was wrong. I think as of this recording, I believe there are 7 people who resigned, and there may be more. They were standing up for what was right. At your job, if you're told to do something that you think is morally wrong, I hope you can take a stand. And hopefully it doesn't have to be this dramatic. Hopefully you don't have to write a letter and say, I quit, go pound sand. But I hope you take it to heart that you have a voice. And it doesn't matter if people who are in authority over you tell you to do something. You have the choice. You do. And I guess that brings us to the next topic that I wanted to discuss. And this is, frankly, I think probably the most important piece of news that has happened maybe since the Trump regime has taken office. President Trump released an executive order this week entitled Ensuring Accountability for All Agencies. And this is one of the most startling pieces of pseudo legislation that I have ever seen. This executive order does a number of things. Essentially, it mandates that every single department of the U.S. government is going to fall under direct control of the sitting president. And this includes even departments that are supposed to be completely independent and apolitical. So that includes things like, for example, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And what does that mean exactly that they are under direct executive control? So first of all, it means that he is going to place a liaison in each department that is going to act as his eyes and ears, essentially. So he'll be able to see and hear exactly what's going on, kind of, on the ground, every minute of every day. He's going to hear the conversations around the water cooler. He's going to get to know what's on people's minds. Secondly, he is saying that he is allowed to judge them by whatever metrics he sets up. So if he sets up a metric that, for example, the IRS needs to come up with a certain number of cases to bring to court, then that's what they're going to have to do. They'll have to fulfill that quota or else, basically. Because the other thing that he's saying he's allowed to do is essentially fund or defund any department at his own discretion. So that means that if he thinks a department is not doing what he wants, regardless, by the way, of what they were actually created and intended to do, then he can defund it. He can say you're fired. You're not going to get to work. You're not going to get to do the things that you're supposed to do. And in combination with that, part of this executive order also says that for the purposes of the federal government, the only people who are allowed to interpret the law are the president himself and his attorney general. So what exactly does that mean? That means that regardless of any kind of legal precedent, regardless of any kind of logic or reasoning, the president and the attorney general are allowed to say what the law actually means. So, for example, if they want to say that if you say something on Twitter or X that is negative towards the current administration, that is a national security threat, and you can be rounded up for it. Even though that seemingly would violate our First Amendment rights, the president is allowed to interpret the law the way that he wants. And if he interprets that whatever you said was, again, some kind of national security threat or incitement of violence, regardless of your intention behind it, he can do that. He can also set and mandate different regulations. So, for example, if he decided that, let's say he and Elon Musk get into a lover's quarrel and they're not getting along so well anymore, he can decide that, you know what, mining lithium is actually really, really bad for the environment. It's so bad for the environment that we're not going to do it anymore, and absolutely tank electric vehicle stock because they need lithium to make their lithium ion batteries. He is essentially taking a unitarian view of the executive branch to its absolute extreme. He's declaring that he is the arbiter of what the law means. It brings to mind a couple of things. First of all, it brings to mind a monarchy, which is seemingly something that he wants, because very shortly after releasing this executive order, he referred to himself as a king and made a mock-up of a Times magazine that had him wearing a crown on it. I find that a little bit disturbing. And second of all, it brings to mind Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson apocryphally said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." He didn't actually say those words, but the idea is still there. Essentially, the Supreme Court told Andrew Jackson and the state of Georgia that they were not allowed to forcibly evacuate the Native Americans in the state. And Andrew Jackson said, "You can tell me it's illegal all you want, but by my estimation, I'm the one who controls the army. I'm the one who controls the police, and I don't think it's illegal. So we're going to go ahead and do it anyway." And that turned into the Trail of Tears, which I'm sure you are at least somewhat familiar with. When the President of the United States engages in such egregious levels of executive overreach, this should worry you. And it doesn't matter what party you subscribe to. Executive overreach is wrong. It was wrong when President Bush did it. It was wrong when President Obama did it. It was wrong when President Trump did it, and when President Biden did it, and when President Trump did it again. Executive overreach is antithetical to democracy. We live in a republic for a reason, and our branches of government are supposed to be co-equals. And I think that might be what I find most disturbing about all of this, is that the Republicans in Congress are not making a fuss. And I have mentioned before how the legislative branch has given up some of its powers before. It has never given up anything to this extent. And I know politicians have a tendency to be somewhat short-sighted, but this seems short-sighted to the point of incompetence almost, which makes me think that maybe they're not being short-sighted at all. Why would Republicans in Congress be okay with the president giving himself such insane levels of power, knowing that a Democrat will eventually, inevitably, be president again? I don't think they would. So what does that tell you they think is going to happen? Look, I'm not trying to be alarmist here. I'm not trying to be the boy who cried wolf that I have talked about a few times on this channel. I tend to, I think, be fairly level-headed, but this executive order genuinely kept me up at night. I think it's not a good sign for what's to come. Now, an interesting thing to note is on the same day he did this executive order, he released another executive order, which was to try and make IVF cheaper, which is great. That's awesome. I am totally in support of that. I think IVF should be cheaper. I think it's a wonderful thing. I don't think it's as big of a deal as this other executive order to give himself oversight over the entire federal government, basically. If you searched for Trump executive order today on Google, guess which executive order would pop up? It wasn't the big scary one. It wasn't the one that's a little complicated and a little hard to wrap your head around. It was the nice one. Cheaper IVF. That's great. Woohoo! This is what I was talking about with the whole flood the zone thing. Trump has been pretty clear, and strategists that he's worked with before, like, for example, Steve Bannon, have been pretty clear. This is their game plan. They want to flood the zone, meaning release as much information as possible all at once, that the really important stuff gets caught up in the mud, right? I mean, if you release 30 executive orders in a day, obviously the most attention grabbing one is going to be the one talking about renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. It means that everything else got lost in the shuffle. If you're doing multiple newsworthy things a day, if you're saying incendiary things every single day, if you are outright lying to news media like he does on a regular basis, if you are saying really offensive and terrible things like he does on a regular basis, it's hard to decipher that from the real serious, deadly serious issues. So when you search for Trump executive order, you're going to get the nice, easy to understand, happy story. The mainstream media works with the establishment. They just do. I mean, Disney, ABC, Fox, they've all come to deals with the Trump administration. They have all made agreements, either like actual contractual agreements, or they've come to terms on lawsuits that they really didn't need to because they absolutely were not going to lose. They have all decided to kowtow to this current administration because that's how they make their money. For example, I mean, the AP News, they are well known as an independent or at least like nonpartisan news source. They just cover what's going on. If you search breaking news, they're usually the first website that pops up. And Trump decided that they don't get access to his newsroom anymore because they refuse to call the Gulf of America the Gulf of America. They're still calling it the Gulf of Mexico. So, of course, if he's going to cut off a news organization entirely over something so petty, then he's definitely going to cut off a news organization if they cover his dirty, rough, scary items more than he wants. So this is what I'm talking about when I say you can't just put your head in the sand. You can't just avoid looking at the news because it's overwhelming and it's scary and it's bad. I really genuinely wonder how many of you actually even heard about this executive order before this video. Because I'm telling you, I listened to a lot of news. I heard it mentioned exactly one time, and it was for about 5 minutes. People are not talking about this because it's getting caught up in the Ukraine stuff, the New York stuff, the everything. And you can't blame them, really. But this might be the most important thing he's done to date. So let me know in the comments below. Did you even hear about this before now? Do you think I'm being alarmist and taking things too far? Because to me, this genuinely looks like our republic is crumbling. And right now, there aren't many people stepping up to speak out against it. So that brings me to the final topic that I wanted to talk about. And this one is, it's not like as political or newsy or whatever. This is just something I've been seeing a lot lately in my own personal life. As I said before, I have been really making an effort to try and reach out to people who I disagree with, sometimes very strongly, on political issues. And a lot of times I hear crickets, but sometimes I have gotten into some really wonderful conversations with people about things that we never would have talked about before. And one topic that has repeatedly come up is I ask them, how can you possibly support MAGA and Trump when it seems to go against what I know about your moral character? These people are frequently Christian. These people are genuine, decent, nice people. So why would they vote for this, frankly, horrible person? This guy who's got like 12 kids from like 6 baby mamas and he cheated on all of them. That seemingly goes against everything I know about these people. And the one answer that I consistently get every single time is, well, I'm pro-life, so I can't vote for a Democrat. To me, that just boggles my mind. And I'm not trying to be rude here, but it's honestly like, it makes my head explode when I hear that. Because let me break it down for you. First of all, Republicans were campaigning for decades about Roe versus Wade getting overturned. That's what they fought for. That's how they got all those single issue voters, the people who said, you know what, I am pro-life and I think a fetus is a baby. And so I am going to fight as hard as I can to protect those lives. And by the way, I have no problem with that at all. I'm actually pro-life myself. Republicans in many ways are kind of like the dog that finally caught the car. Okay, so what do you do now? Well, they got Roe versus Wade overturned, and now it's a states' rights issue. So the president really has almost nothing at all to do with the abortion debate anymore. It's not really a national debate, it's a local debate. And many states have already settled that debate too. They either essentially made it illegal, outright made it illegal, or wrote it into their constitution to protect the right to choose. So when you say you're pro-life and that means you can't vote for somebody like Kamala Harris, that doesn't really ring true to me. It doesn't make sense. Kamala Harris was not going to make abortion legal nationwide. That's not something she can do. She can't write an executive order that says anybody can get an abortion in any state. Like that's just not something she can do. If she tried to, it would be immediately overturned, like some of these Trump executive orders are. So to me, pro-life does not just mean anti-abortion. I mean, that's a big part of it, sure, but that's not the whole thing. I mean, pro-life means pro-life. Like you consider life to be sacred. You consider life to be the greatest gift that we have. The most valuable commodity that we have in our country is life, the life of a child. So to me, that means, yes, okay, anti-abortion, sure. But that also means making sure that children don't go hungry. And I already talked with you about the stats on that in our very first episode. It means that you make sure that if people absolutely have to have childcare, they can get it. It means that you raise wages so that children can have a parent staying home. There are a lot of things that encompass pro-life. I mean, healthcare. Healthcare is fundamental to the idea of being pro-life. And you've got one party that, generally speaking, is arguing for more universal healthcare. And you've got one party that is actively right now in the process of cutting Medicaid. Which party do you think is really pro-life here? Because I'm telling you, the president has nothing to do with abortion anymore. They just don't. So if you want to say, okay, I could never vote for my governor to be a Democrat because I'm pro-life and I'm afraid that they're going to try and get the state constitution changed or whatever. Okay, fine. I mean, there's a discussion there, right? But when you say you can't vote for a Democrat for president because you're pro-life, that makes no sense. It's just not logical. There is no foundation for you there. To me, it seems like you have been brainwashed. The Republicans have run this PSYOP campaign for decades now that they are the Christian party, right? They're the party of Jesus. I'm telling you, if you think that, if you genuinely think that, I challenge you to go pick up your Bible. It's pretty simple. You can just look for the red letters. That's what Jesus said. And really, I mean, it's not going to take long. He frankly didn't talk that much in the Bible. Look at everything he said. Look at how he talked about clothing the least of these and taking care of the poor and turning the other cheek. And the meek will inherit the earth. The meek, not somebody like Trump. I promise you, if you actually read the words in the Bible that Jesus said, and you look at what the two different parties are doing right now, you're going to find that one of them does match up a lot more with what he was saying. And it's not the Republicans, and it damn sure isn't Trump. So I really want to challenge you. If you say, I have to vote Republican because I'm a Christian, please just look past the surface. Okay? I get it. Republicans love hosting their, prayer rallies. They love holding up these Christian banners and wearing the cloak of Christianity to pretend like they've got some kind of moral high ground. But it really is virtue signaling. And if you really look and don't just listen to what they say, but look at what they do, I promise you, you're going to be surprised. Take a look at, for example, Senator Bernie Sanders. I know he has, in many ways, kind of become a meme at this point, right? Here's how Bernie can still win. Well, look, that dude, if you look at what Jesus says in the Bible about taking care of the poor, feeding the hungry, clothing people who don't have coats to wear, that guy who is ethnically Jewish and basically non-religious is a lot closer to what Jesus says than any mainstream Republican. And I get you want to be fiscally responsible, right? And if that's your argument for why you can never vote for a Democrat, fine. Okay. Let that be your argument. Say it's about the money. But please don't pretend like the reason you can't vote for a Democrat is because you're Christian or because you're pro-life. Don't. You're not being honest with yourself or with anybody you're talking to. Have a little respect. Come clean. It's about the money. That's fine. It's about the culture war. That's fine. You think Democrats are weird. You're uncomfortable with LGBTQ stuff. Whatever. That just be honest about it. Jesus had absolutely nothing to say about drag queen story hour or trans people. I promise. Look through the whole Bible if you want. It's not in there. He said love. Love your neighbor. Love the people around you. Love the people who you think are weird. Take care of the people who can't take care of themselves. Because at the end of the day, the meek will inherit the earth. If you want to join the community, I've got a link to the Discord in the description, as always. I've got other information down there too if you're struggling with your mental health or you just find it kind of hard to deal with. I've got some links down there too because it's always important to take care of your mental health. And don't forget, when you change your perspective, your reality changes. I'll see you next week.